Hello everyone! In this video, we are going to look at square roots and some common formulas regarding them. So let's get started. So for starters, let's recap what exactly is a square root. So if we have some number raised to the second power, we say it's squared. So here, 4 squared is 4 times 4, which is 16. So if we have a square that's side length is 4, the area of the square is 16 because the area of a square is base times the height. So 4 times 4. So that's where we get the term squared. Now, if squaring is multiplying by itself, the square root is the inverse operation of that. So if we do the square operation here, we get 16. The inverse operation would undo that. So in other words, the square root gives us the base number that would need to be raised to the power of 2 in order to get 16. So the square root of 16 is 4. Or if we think about our square here, the square root of the surface area of this square gives us the length of the square's sides. So the length that would need to be squared in order to get the surface area of the square. So if we now look at the definition of the square root, we can see that the square root of the number a is b if and only if these two conditions are met, which are, number 1, b squared equals a, and number 2, that b is greater than or equal to 0. Alright, so let's now look at some useful square root formulas. So our first one tells us that the square root of a times b is the same as the square root of a times the square root of b. So let's say that we have here the square root of 2 times square root of 8. So neither of these gives us a result that's a whole number. So if we don't have a calculator, it's difficult to calculate these. But now let's apply our formula here. So this is the same as square root of 2 times 8, so square root of 16, which is 4. So we have now solved our example with the help of this formula. The same applies for divisions. So the square root of a divided by b is the same as the square root of a divided by the square root of b. Applying these formulas in both directions, depending on the problem, is very useful. Our next formula tells us that the square root of a raised to the power of 2 is the same as a. So we previously saw squaring and square rooting are inverse operations of each other, so therefore they cancel each other out, and therefore we are left with a. And this one, on the other hand, tells us that the square root of a squared is the same as the absolute value of a. Because if we look at the square root definition again, we cannot take the square root of a negative number. But because here the a is squared, and therefore the a can also be a negative value because negative times negative is positive, and that's why we get the absolute value of a as the result. So slight difference between these two, so be sure to be able to differentiate between them. So let's now look at a simple square equation. So we have x squared equals 16. So now, to solve for x, we take the square root from both sides of the equation, which removes the exponent 2, because again, the inverse operation of squaring is the square root. So we get x is plus minus square root 16. Let's now diverge a bit to once again look at our definition of a square root. So as we can see in the second condition, b has to be greater than or equal to 0, because otherwise, for example with the square root of 9, the answer could be 3 or minus 3. So the square root of 9 would have two different answers. So therefore, we have this second condition, which means that we always get only one answer from square roots, and that answer has to be positive. So negative square roots are not defined. So why is it that here we have this plus minus sign in front of our square root? I mean, shouldn't this result only in a positive answer? Instead, the answer is x is 4 or minus 4. Well, this is an important detail to pay attention to. So because our equation is x squared equals 16, it means that the value minus 4 also makes our equation true. Because if you think about it, minus 4 times minus 4 is also 16. So in other words, here we are solving for what values x can have to make this equation true. And because x is raised to an even power, we also need to include the negative value. So the plus minus sign is used due to the exponent and not because of the square root. So the square root of 16 is still only 4 and not also minus 4. So an important difference here to pay attention to. Alright, so lastly, I want to quickly talk about the square root symbol. So as we know, this essentially means what number do we need to multiply by itself to get this number. But what about this sign or this one? So now we need to figure out what numbers times 3 times itself, or what number cubed, results in this number, and so on. So the square root symbol basically should have a 2 here, but it's represented like this without the 2. So this is just something that's good to know.